On Christmas Eve, I was sitting alone in my tiny Raleigh apartment, listening to the muffled sound of my neighbors singing carols through thin walls when my phone buzzed with a bank alert that made my stomach flip. Alert. Charge of $15,800 posted to your credit card. I stared at the notification, waiting for it to make sense, for it to rearrange itself into something logical. My card was in my wallet. I hadn't used it in 2 days. I tapped the email, and there it was, a luxury Caribbean cruise package balcony, suite spa upgrades, private excursions, 4 passengers. Before I could breathe, my phone lit up again with an incoming call. My mother's laughter flooded through the speaker, loud and sharp, mixed with clinking glasses and ocean wind. "Mara, don't freak out. It's not like you ever go anywhere anyway. Aubrey deserves something nice." My father shouted in the background, "We're all going, Merry Christmas, and thanks for covering it." Then Aubrey, giggling, her voice dripping with the entitlement she was practically raised on. "Hope you don't mind, sis. This cruise is gonna change my life." The call ended with my mother's final jab, a laugh-soaked dismissal. "Relax. What's yours is ours." I sat in the glow of the Christmas lights, realizing my own family had robbed me and celebrated doing it. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there at the small kitchen table in the apartment I'd been forced into after my parents claimed my house as their sanctuary. Outside, someone's kids were building a snowman, and the hum of holiday traffic drifted in, cheerful and warm. Inside, everything felt frozen. My breath, my thoughts, the space around me. $15,800. The number pulsed in my mind like a bruise. They didn't even ask. They didn't warn me. They didn't include me. The warmth that usually seeped through this neighborhood on Christmas Eve, the cookies baking next door, the distant laughter, the sense of shared celebration felt like something I was watching from behind glass. I kept seeing the cruise confirmation in my inbox, the 4 names listed on the reservation. Carl Jensen, Diana Jensen, Aubrey Jensen, and guest 4, which I assumed was Aubrey's latest situationship, a man who had never held a job longer than 6 weeks, but somehow deserved a luxury balcony suite on my card. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly, trying to keep my heartbeat from spiraling. This wasn't new. Not really. It was outrageous, yes, but not surprising. My family had spent most of my life conditioning me to accept being used. I was the reliable one, the responsible one, the daughter who wouldn't say no. I stood, grabbed my coat, and walked to the window, watching snow drift across the parking lot. I remembered all the times I'd covered Aubrey's messes, bailed her out financially, helped my parents when they asked for just a little help. I remembered the nights I stayed up late reworking my budget so I could afford both my bills and theirs. I remembered moving out of my own house, my 3-bedroom home in Raleigh that I bought at 28, because they told me my presence was disruptive to their routine. I remembered how they walked through my house like they owned it, shifting furniture, repainting walls, replacing my photos with pictures of Aubrey at pageants, graduations, vacations. I remembered signing the mortgage every month while living in an 800-square-foot rental. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Diana. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of the house while we're gone." My house. The one I bought. The one I planned to build a future in. The one they turned into a shrine to Aubrey and treated like a family estate they were entitled to. The way she wrote it, as if it belonged to them, as if I should be grateful they were occupying it, hit me harder than the charge on my card. I sat back down, placing the phone screen down on the table, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, not the usual mix of guilt and frustration, something colder, clearer, a kind of emotional sobriety I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. This was exploitation. It had always been exploitation. And for the first time, instead of trying to justify it or rationalize it or excuse it, I simply let the truth land. I stood and walked toward the narrow bookshelf where I kept my old journals. I opened the latest one, flipped to the most recent blank page, and wrote a single sentence. "They don't see me as family. They see me as a resource. The words felt heavy and liberating at the same time. It was the first honest thing I'd said to myself in years. Closing the journal, I looked around the apartment one more time. The chipped countertops, the dim lights, the cramped space I never wanted but settled for because my parents told me I should. And then I walked back to my laptop, opened it, and typed into the search bar, "How to sell a house quickly in Raleigh, NC." The screen glowed back at me, illuminating the new resolve taking shape in my chest. If they wanted to treat me like an ATM, then they were about to learn what happened when the machine stopped dispensing. I woke up the morning after Christmas with that same hollow pressure sitting on my chest, the kind that made breathing feel like swallowing cold air. For a brief second, I forgot what had happened. Then the memory of $15,800 disappearing off my credit card came rushing back. The betrayal wasn't new, but the scale of it made everything look sharper, colder, and painfully familiar. It reminded me of every moment growing up when my needs were treated like background noise. I made coffee and sat at the tiny table again, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. The bitterness grounded me, pulling me back into the present. But my mind refused to stay here. It dragged me into the past, to Charleston, South Carolina, where all of this conditioning began. I grew up in a small 2-story house with blue shutters and a porch swing my father fixed every spring. It looked picture-perfect on the outside, but the inside was a one-directional stage show starring my sister Aubrey, the golden child of the Jensen family. Aubrey was born 2 years after me, all blonde curls and bright blue eyes, everything my mother loved to flaunt. "She's our little star," Diana would say to neighbors, relatives, strangers at the grocery store. I was the quiet one, the practical one, the one who handed over her allowance when bills were tight or cleaned up after Christmas dinner while everyone else napped. Aubrey danced, sparkled, smiled. I worked. That was the dynamic from the beginning. I remembered one Christmas clearly. Aubrey was 7, I was 9. She unwrapped a Barbie dream house multi-level complete with the elevator and the convertible car. I opened my gift to find a discounted craft kit with half the paint tubes already cracked. My mother said, "You like art, don't you?" and went back to watching Aubrey squeal. That was the year I learned not to expect fairness, especially not on holidays. Birthdays weren't much different. When Aubrey turned 8, she got a brand new pink bicycle with streamers on the handlebars. When I turned 10, my parents said money was tight, but I could borrow Aubrey's bike whenever she wasn't using it. She never wasn't using it. And when she finally threw a tantrum about wanting the bike to herself again, my father gently told me, "You need to set a good example. You're older." That became my identity, the example. The helper, the one who understood, the one who didn't need as much. I worked part-time jobs as soon as I was legally old enough. Babysitting, grocery bagging, waiting tables to buy my own school supplies, clothes, even my first phone. My parents praised my independence, but they ensured Aubrey never grew any. They covered her college application fees, her car insurance, her senior trip. When she got caught shoplifting at 13, my parents shielded her so fiercely you'd think she was the victim. When my grades slipped because I was juggling school and work, Diana said, "You'll figure it out. You always do." I used to think they believed in me. Now I know they relied on me. I remembered overhearing Diana talk to a neighbor when I was 16. "Aubrey has such a bright future ahead," she said proudly. "Mara will be fine. She doesn't need much." I stood on the stairs frozen, hearing myself reduced to a placeholder. Someone expected to survive on scraps of attention. Someone whose dreams required no investment. That was the first time something inside me cracked. College only made the contrast clearer. I attended a state university on scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. Aubrey went to a private art institute because she needs the right environment to flourish. They visited her every month. They never visited me. When I asked my father why, he said, "You're strong. You don't need us hovering." Translation. Aubrey required hand-holding. I required nothing. After graduation, I landed a stable job at an auditing firm and started sending money home whenever Carl claimed he needed help. Aubrey bounced between cosmetology school, boutique, retail, travel blogging, each phase ending in a financial disaster, each one cushioned by my parents and my savings. Diana constantly reminded me family helps each other. Funny how family always meant me sacrificing them receiving. The biggest shift came when I bought my house in Raleigh. I was proud of it, 3 bedrooms, a fenced yard, hardwood floors in the living room. It was the first thing I ever had that felt like a reward for years of grinding alone. Then Carl lost his job. Diana called crying, claiming they'd be homeless. They needed 6 months max. I said yes because that was my role. 6 months became a year. A year became 3. My home slowly transformed into something that reflected them, not me. Aubrey's photos filled the walls. My mother turned the 2nd bedroom into her craft room. Carl used the garage like it was his personal workshop. When I suggested moving back into my own house, Diana arched her brow and said, "Mara, don't disrupt our routine. You have your own place." Worst of all, I accepted it. I kept the peace. I let myself be erased in my own home. Sitting at my little apartment table now, I felt the weight of all those years settling like dust on my skin. The cruise charge wasn't the first betrayal. It was the last straw in a lifetime of them. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee, thinking how strange it felt to be 32, and only now realizing that my family had never seen me. Not really. They saw what I did for them, what I provided, how little I complained. I opened my journal to the sentence I wrote the night before. They don't see me as family, they see me as a resource. I added a second line beneath it. I deserve a life where I matter. The words didn't feel dramatic. They felt overdue. I closed the journal, stood, and took a slow breath. If I didn't change the pattern now, I knew with absolute clarity that they never would. I drove back to the house the day after Christmas, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly as I turned into the quiet cul-de-sac. The street looked exactly as it always had: kids' bikes on porches, wreaths on doors, the faint smell of pine drifting from someone's chimney. But as I pulled into the driveway of my own home, the one place I once imagined building a future, something in me felt foreign and unwelcome. My parents were still on their cruise, so the house stood silent, blinds drawn, lights off. I let myself in with the spare key I'd never returned, stepping into the stillness that should have felt like mine, but didn't. The air smelled like my mother's lavender plug-ins, the kind that always gave me headaches. My father's boots sat by the hallway bench, coated in mud he never bothered to clean. A glittery scarf Aubrey's was draped over the arm of my old sofa. I walked through the entryway and felt like an intruder in a place I paid for, a guest in the home I had lovingly chosen for myself. 3 years earlier, when my parents begged me to let them stay, this house had looked different. It was warm, hopeful, a symbol of everything I had worked for through college, through long nights at my auditing job, through sacrifices I didn't think twice about. They cried when they moved in, claiming they'd lost everything and had no one else. Just 6 months, Mara, they promised. A year at most, until your father gets back on his feet. I believed them because I wanted to. Because daughters like me always want to. 6 months turned into years so quietly, I didn't notice the exact moment the house stopped belonging to me. It started with small things: my mother asking if she could move her craft supplies into the spare bedroom, my father storing just a few tools in the garage. Then the small things grew. My office became Aubrey's wardrobe room when she needed space while finding herself. My master bedroom was turned into Diana's meditation room because she needed peace for her nerves. My photos were taken off the walls and replaced with shots of Aubrey posing on beaches, at concerts, on trips I never knew about. I walked down the hallway now, studying the framed photos. Every single one featured my parents and Aubrey. Aubrey at prom. Aubrey at her short-lived photography phase. Aubrey blowing out candles at a birthday party I wasn't even invited to. There wasn't a single image of me, not even from my college graduation. I wasn't erased by accident. I was edited out on purpose. I wandered into what used to be my office. Clothes were piled everywhere, makeup palettes open on the desk, a ring light set up in the corner. A handwritten note taped to the wall read, Aubrey's room, do not move anything. The double exclamation points felt like a knife. This wasn't a home, it was a shrine to her. I went into the living room and opened a drawer in the TV console. Stacks of unopened mail, spilled out bills, notices, forms, all addressed to me. Property tax statements, mortgage paperwork, utility notices, some with late fees. They never told me. They just let them pile up, knowing I'd eventually discover them and pay. A familiar anger rushed through me, but this time it didn't scare me. It clarified everything. Curiosity, or maybe dread, pulled me into my father's workshop. It used to be my organized garage with neatly labeled storage bins and a rack for tools I actually used. Now it was chaos. Manuals scattered, nails, extension cords tangled like vines. I opened the bottom drawer of his old desk and found a stack of printed documents labeled "Property Important." My heart kicked hard. I lifted the papers. Inside were photocopies of the deed, my name alone on every page. Next were handwritten notes in my mother's script circled with red pen. Add Aubrey as beneficiary later. Ask lawyer about transfer options. Prepare her room when she moves back home. My throat closed. They hadn't just acted like the house was theirs, they were planning to pass it down to Aubrey as if I didn't exist. A knock on the side door startled me. I turned to see Mr. Reed, the neighbor from across the street, bundled in a winter coat. "Didn't expect to see you," he said with a friendly smile. "Your parents told us they were handling everything here while you were off living your busy life." I forced a tight smile. "Just checking on things." He stepped closer. "They mentioned they're thinking of refinancing soon. Said once Aubrey settles down, the house will be perfect for her and her future kids." He chuckled warmly as if this was charming, as if this wasn't a theft in slow motion. I thanked him, closed the door, and leaned against it, my pulse thudding. They had rewritten the narrative so completely that even the neighbors believed the house was theirs. I walked through one last time, letting myself feel every sting, every wound, every moment I had ignored for years. The lavender scent, the photos, the clutter, the erased spaces, evidence of how easily my family had pushed me out of my own life. Standing in the living room, my living room paid for by my salary, my sacrifices, my name on the deed, I whispered aloud for the first time, "This is my house." The words felt foreign, but they felt right. I stepped outside onto the porch and looked around the neighborhood. A sold in 3 days sign 2 houses down swayed in the breeze. A quiet spark flickered in my chest, a small flame that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with survival. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, then it was time to remove myself from their story and take my house with me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's laughing face as she said, "What's yours is ours," and felt that cold, flat finality in her tone. By the time the sun pushed through the blinds the next morning, I already knew I couldn't go through another year, another day, letting them take pieces of my life without hesitation. I sat at my tiny kitchen table again, coffee cooling untouched, and stared at the manila folder I had taken from the house. It rested there like an accusation. I opened it again slowly. The photocopy of the deed sat on top. My name alone. No Carl Jensen. No Diana Jensen. No Aubrey. Just mine. The legal truth staring back at me, stark and undeniable. Beneath it were my mother's notes, some written in her delicate cursive, others scribbled hastily like she was trying to hide her intentions even from herself. "Ask about transfer options," she wrote. "Aubrey future beneficiary. Keep Mara from interfering." One line underlined twice made my throat tighten. She doesn't need this house. Aubrey does. It wasn't the first time my mother had chosen my sister over me, but it was the first time she tried to erase me from something I paid for with my own life, my own hours, my own exhaustion, my own hope for independence. I picked up my phone with trembling fingers and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice breezy and warm, as though she hadn't stolen nearly $16,000 from me less than 48 hours earlier. Mara, I've been waiting for you to call. The weather here is perfect sunny every day. Aubrey looks stunning. I took pictures. You'll love them. I need to talk to you about the charge, I said, keeping my voice controlled. She sighed loudly, irritated. Oh, don't start. It's Christmas, for heaven's sake. You're so dramatic. We'll pay you back eventually. You had no right to use my card. Oh, please, she snapped. You make good money. You never travel anyway. It's not like you're doing anything else with it. My father's voice cut through in the background, slurred with morning champagne. Tell her to relax. She should be happy for us. I felt my jaw tighten. And you're all going, even Aubrey's boyfriend? Of course, my mother laughed. Someone needs to keep her company. And it's a family trip. A family trip I wasn't invited to, I said quietly. There was a brief silence. Then she said, Mara, you're always busy with that job of yours. You wouldn't have enjoyed it. Besides, what's yours is ours. That's how family works. Something inside me went still. It wasn't anger this time. It was clarity, cold, sharp, undeniable. You really believe that? I asked. I know it, she replied. We deserve something nice. Your sister needs a break after everything. Don't make this about money. Money. The thing they never had enough of and always expected from me. The thing I worked endless hours to earn while they spent freely. The thing Aubrey treated like confetti fluttering through her fingers without consequence. My voice came out calm, steady, almost serene. Enjoy your trip, Mom. She hesitated. She wasn't used to me surrendering. Well, that's more like it, she said slowly. I knew you'd be reasonable. I hung up without another word. The apartment fell silent again, the kind of silence that feels like the world waiting for your next decision. I sat there for a long moment thinking about how many times I had let conversations end like that, her satisfied me depleted. How many times I'd folded myself into smaller and smaller shapes just to fit into the space they allowed me. Not this time. I opened my laptop and started researching. Home value Raleigh, sell house fast. Legal rights sole owner. My cursor hovered over an article titled, What You Can Do When Family Treats You Like a Financial Resource. I didn't click it. I didn't need to. I already knew the answer. A knock at my door startled me. It was my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Parker, carrying a small container of gingerbread cookies. Thought you might need some sweetness today, she said kindly. I thanked her, and after she left, I stared at the cookies for a long moment. Sweetness. That was something my own home hadn't had in years. I took a bite tasting cinnamon and warmth, and then opened a new tab on my browser real estate agents near me. A list populated instantly. Some looked inexperienced, some looked disinterested. But one name caught my eye, Naomi Pierce, fast sales specialist. 5-star reviews, phrases like efficient professional gets things done. My finger hovered over the call button. My heart thudded. I thought of my mother laughing on her cruise balcony. I thought of Aubrey posting photos from the ship spa. I thought of my father drinking champagne on my dime. I pressed the button. Naomi answered on the first ring. This is Naomi. How can I help you? I want to sell my house, I said. And I need to do it quickly. She paused only a beat before responding, her voice crisp and sure. I can help with that. How soon can you meet? I glanced at the manila folder again. At the plans they made for my home. At the place they had rewritten history to claim as theirs. Today, I said. I can meet today. I returned to the house the next morning with a different kind of energy in my body. Steady, cold, deliberate. No more drifting through the motions. No more letting their version of reality overwrite mine. I walked up the front steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into the silent house with a purpose. This time I wasn't there to reminisce or gather memories. I was there to uncover the truth they'd worked so hard to bury. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn the way my mother always kept them. I walked to the nearest window and pulled them open, letting sunlight pour in like a spotlight on everything they'd taken over. I noticed small details I'd missed before: how my favorite framed art had been replaced with floral prints. Diana liked how the rug I bought had been swapped with one Aubrey claimed fit the vibe better. How even the coasters on the coffee table were ones I'd never seen before. If a stranger walked in, they'd think this was Carl and Diana's home, not mine. I started with the kitchen. It had always been my mother's domain, but it was mine first. I opened every drawer, every cabinet. I wasn't sure what I was searching for until I found a stack of envelopes shoved in a drawer beneath the junk mail bills, notices, bank statements, property tax letters. All addressed to me. None of them opened. Some overdue. A late fee stamped in red glared at me like a warning I'd never received. They weren't just living here for free, they were hiding my own mail from me. My stomach clenched, but I kept going. I moved through the dining room and into the hallway, feeling more like a detective than a daughter. I entered the meditation room my mother set up in what used to be my master bedroom. Soft music still played on a loop from a tiny speaker. The smell of incense lingered, clinging to my skin. I walked along the wall of framed photos, dozens of Aubrey smiling at various life events. Standing in the middle of the room, I counted them. 32 pictures of my sister. Not a single one of me. It was as if they'd erased me from my own life. I swallowed the tightness in my throat and moved on. The small guest room had become their makeshift storage space. Boxes labeled "Aubrey's Things Do Not Touch" filled the floor. I knelt beside one and lifted the flap. Inside were expensive designer shoes, tags still attached, purchased with money she never earned. Beneath those were spa receipts and scribbled notes from my mother. "Aubrey owes this, Mara will cover next month." No wonder Aubrey acted like life was a performance exclusively for her comfort. She'd been trained for the role. I stepped into the garage last my father's workshop. Tools lay scattered across the floor, boxes of hardware, old paint cans, broken equipment piled in corners. I opened a drawer in his desk and found it immediately. The manila folder I'd brought home yesterday hadn't been the only one. This drawer held more folders labeled "House Insurance Estate Planning." My pulse hammered as I reached for the one marked "Estate Planning." Inside were printed emails between my father and a local estate planner. Phrases jumped out at me. "Ensure smooth transfer to daughter Aubrey. Owner is unlikely to resist. Prepare necessary documents for future inheritance." A chill climbed up my spine. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping. They were plotting. I flipped through several pages until I found the one that made my breath catch. A checklist in my mother's handwriting. Prepare Aubrey's old room. Ask lawyer about beneficiary transfer. Keep Mara busy. Avoid talks about moving out. House must remain in family line. The final line underlined 3 times. Aubrey deserves security. I stood there gripping the paper, my fingers trembling. They truly believed that my life existed to create security for my sister. That my work, my money, my house, all of it was meant to flow one direction toward Aubrey. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me turn. Someone was approaching the open garage door. It was Mr. Reed, my neighbor, carrying a bag of salt for the icy sidewalk. He smiled warmly. "Morning, Mara. Didn't expect to see you until the new year. Your parents said they've got big renovation plans for the spring. Something about refinishing the kitchen. Sounded exciting." My mouth went dry. "Renovation plans. Oh yes," he continued casually. "And they mentioned something about getting the upstairs ready for when Aubrey moves back in. Said the house will be perfect for raising her kids." I nodded wordlessly as he walked away, a friendly wave in his hand. He had no idea what he'd just confirmed. They'd rewritten the whole story so thoroughly that even the neighbors believed the house belonged to them and would belong to Aubrey someday. I went back inside, walked to the dining room table, and laid out everything I'd found. The deed, the emails, the tax letters, the notes, the plans for my future that didn't include me. I stared at the pile for a long moment, feeling the weight of years of being the responsible one, the dependable one, the invisible one. Then something shifted. a quiet click inside my chest. A realization so clear it rang through me like a bell. They weren't going to change. So I would. I gathered the documents, took photos for proof, locked up the house, and stepped back into the cold winter air. As I walked to my car, the crisp wind stinging my cheeks, I saw a real estate sign down the street, sold in 3 days. The red banner fluttered like a signal sent straight to me. If they wanted to plan my future without me, I could plan theirs without permission. I got into my car, started the engine, and whispered into the quiet, "It's my name on the deed." I woke up the next morning knowing exactly what I needed to do. There was no hesitation, no guilt twisting my stomach, no voice telling me to be reasonable the way my parents always had. What filled me instead was a heavy, steady calm, the kind that settles in once you finally stop lying to yourself. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and typed, "Sell my house, Raleigh, NC." Search results filled the screen instantly. Agents, cash buyers listings, market reports. I clicked through article after article, my heartbeat slow and deliberate. Every question I had, every fear I once would have obsessed over, melted under the simple truth staring back at me. I was the only name on the deed. Legally, financially, fundamentally, this house was mine. Not theirs. Mine. No rental agreement. No tenancy contract. No rights for them to remain in it. Every website confirmed the same thing: as the sole owner, I held full authority. They had treated the house like some inheritance in waiting, like a gift they were graciously allowing me to give them someday. But they had never earned it. And they certainly didn't deserve to keep it. I called 3 real estate agencies. The first 2 barely listened before telling me they were fully booked until the new year. But the third one, Naomi Pierce, answered on the second ring with a crisp, confident, "This is Naomi. How can I help?" "I want to sell my house," I said. "Fast." "How fast?" she asked, not missing a beat. "As soon as possible." She hummed thoughtfully. Address I gave it, half expecting her to hesitate like the others. Instead, she said, "That neighborhood sells very quickly. Can you meet today? Coffee shop on Glenwood at noon." I surprised us both by saying, "Yes." 2 hours later, Naomi walked into the cafe exactly on time. Tall and sharp in a charcoal coat, carrying a leather portfolio. She got straight to work unfolding market reports across the table. "Your area is highly desirable," she said, tapping the numbers with her pen. "Single-family homes with recent updates. Excellent value. If you want a fast sale, we'll price strategically and push for a cash buyer." Her confidence made my spine straighten. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Transparency," she said. "Who lives in the home currently?" I took a breath. "My parents and my sister. They're out of town." She paused only a second. "Vacant is ideal. This actually works in your favor." We left the cafe and drove separately to the house. Naomi met me at the curb, pulling out her phone to take notes. She walked through the rooms, decisively opening closets, examining windows, testing faucets, pacing across floors. She was professional, unfazed by the clutter, the mismatched decor, the evidence my parents had turned my home into their own personal kingdom. She paused in the living room, studying the natural light. "Beautiful bones," she said. "Staging will help, but the structure is strong." We moved toward the hallway. She nudged open my father's old workshop door and surveyed the space. "This is a major selling point," she said. "Plenty of buyers look for functional garages. Once the personal items are removed, it will photograph very well." It took everything in me not to laugh at the irony my father's chaos being a selling point. She turned to me. "They won't mind these changes." A cold, honest answer came out of me before I could soften it. "They don't get a say." Naomi nodded once, as if she understood more than she let on. She led the way outside to the backyard, pacing the fence line. Given market demand, she said finally, this house could go under contract within 72 hours. The number hung between us like a doorway. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. I thought of my mother's laughter on the cruise ship dripping with entitlement. Of my father insisting I should be grateful to pay for their vacation. Of Aubrey posting poolside photos captioned, "Best Christmas ever." I thought of the notes they left for themselves planning how to transfer my home to my sister. Of every year I had sacrificed to make their lives comfortable. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." Inside, Naomi laid documents on the dining table. "This is the listing agreement," she explained. "Once you sign, I'll coordinate cleaners, photographers' listings, open houses, everything." My hand hovered over the pen. For a moment, guilt tried to claw its way back in. I heard my mother's voice saying, "Mara, don't be dramatic," and my father adding, "Family shares everything." I saw every Christmas where Aubrey received gifts piled to the ceiling while mine fit in a single bag. I felt the sting of being told to move out of my own house because my presence made things stressful. I lowered the pen onto the paper and signed. Naomi smiled. "Congratulations. You're taking your life back." It was such a simple thing to say, but the words hit deep. Taking my life back. I let them settle like an anchor in my chest. We walked outside to her car, the winter air crisp and clean. "You'll hear from me later today," she said, sliding into the driver's seat. "This is going to move fast." As she drove away, I looked back at the house, at the windows my mother kept covered, at the porch my father claimed as his, at the rooms Aubrey filled with her discarded ambitions. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like the place where I was pushed aside. It felt like leverage. It felt like justice. It felt like mine, and soon it wouldn't be theirs. Naomi's email hit my inbox at 7:42 the next morning with the subject line, "We're live." I stared at it for a moment, letting the words sink in. The house, my house, was officially on the market. The listing included a bright set of photos staged and spotless, looking nothing like the space my parents had cluttered with their mess and entitlement. It looked like a home again. A home I could release. A home I no longer needed to carry on my back. My phone buzzed with a new notification, then another, and another. Photos from the cruise. My mother with a glass of champagne. Aubrey posing in a bikini on the deck. A video of my father dancing awkwardly during a poolside contest. Each message was accompanied by little captions meant to be cutesy, but laced with the same entitlement I'd spent my whole life drowning in. Best Christmas ever. Wish you were here, Mara, but you'd hate the sun, lol. We're so relaxed. Thank you for making this possible. I set the phone down without replying. For once, their noise couldn't touch me. At 9:15, Naomi called. "Morning, Mara. You ready for your first day update?" "I am," I said, though my heart had already started beating faster. "We've had 37 inquiries since the listing went live. 6 showing requests already." I blinked, stunned. "It's only been an hour." "This is a hot neighborhood," Naomi said warmly. "I told you it would move fast." As soon as we hung up, I felt something shift, an odd mix of disbelief, adrenaline, and a swelling sense of validation. While they drank champagne in the sun, I was finally doing something for myself. Something that couldn't be undone. Around noon, I remembered the day I handed over my house key. It had been 2 years earlier, a tense conversation in the kitchen. I had suggested I might move back in after struggling with the rent in my apartment. My mother had paused only long enough to give a sympathetic frown. "Mara, sweetheart, your father's back is terrible right now. We finally feel settled here. Going in and out would make it too chaotic." My father nodded dramatically, as if moving his toothbrush would snap his spine. "You have your own place," he said. "Let us enjoy this home." I didn't fight. I drove back to my apartment and cried for 2 hours, convinced that rejecting me was normal parental behavior. Now looking back, I saw the manipulation for what it was, a slow erasure. A decades-long conditioning that taught me not to need space support or even a home of my own. At 3:30, Naomi texted, "Showing number 3 finished. Great reactions. Expect offers tonight." I felt a flutter in my chest, fear or excitement, I wasn't sure. At 4, another message, "Call me ASAP." I stepped onto my tiny balcony, the winter air biting at my cheeks as I dialed her number. Naomi answered immediately. "We have a cash buyer," she said. "Young married couple. They want to make an offer above asking." My breath caught. Above. They love the house. They said it feels like the right place to start their life. They're serious and ready to move fast. I leaned against the railing, staring at the parking lot below. People walked their dogs, carried groceries, lived quiet, ordinary lives. And here I was, listening to words that felt unreal. After everything my family took, after every year I spent shrinking to keep peace, something good, something mine was happening. "When will they send the offer?" I asked shakily. "Within the hour," Naomi said. "I'll forward everything as soon as it arrives." "Thank you," I whispered. When I hung up, my thoughts drifted back to my phone. It sat on the kitchen counter, still buzzing. I flipped it over. A new message from my mother lit the screen. "We're thinking of extending the cruise. Aubrey wants another spa package. You don't mind, do you? Merry Christmas?" They had no idea. No idea that while they were celebrating with piña coladas, the ground beneath them had shifted. No idea that the home they treated as their entitlement was already being walked through by buyers. No idea that the door they locked behind them before leaving would no longer belong to them when they returned. At 5:51, Naomi called again. "The offer's in. Full cash. 20,000 above asking. Closing can happen in a week." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me like warm water. A week. All the years I spent being invisible, forgotten, overlooked, and now everything was moving with a momentum I couldn't have imagined even days ago. "When can we sign?" I asked. "Tonight, if you're available," she replied. "Or tomorrow morning." "Tonight," I said. "I want this done." I met Naomi at her office as the sun dipped behind the Raleigh skyline, painting the sky in streaks of deep orange. The conference room was quiet, polished, filled with soft lighting and neatly stacked paperwork. Naomi walked me through each page: purchase agreement, closing timeline, contingencies. My hand trembled only slightly as I picked up the pen. Every signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. When I signed the final page, Naomi clasped her hands together. "Congratulations, Mara. You just sold your house." I breathed out slowly, almost laughing. "Thank you," I said. "Really?" She packed the documents neatly. "This is a new chapter. You did the right thing." Outside, the night air felt electric, crisp, clean. Like oxygen I hadn't breathed in years. I stood by my car watching the lights flicker across the street, feeling something inside me unfurl. My parents once told me that family shares everything. They were about to learn what happened when that sharing was no longer one-sided. Let them enjoy their luxury cruise, because when they came home, everything would be different. Closing day arrived with the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. I woke before my alarm, dressed without turning on the TV, and drank my coffee in absolute stillness. My house would no longer be mine by noon, and the strangest part was that I didn't feel fear. Not guilt, not conflict, just a clean, precise sense of finality, like I'd reached the end of a sentence I'd been trying to finish for years. I drove to the property a little earlier than Naomi had requested. The familiar sound of gravel under my tires echoed through the empty driveway. I stepped out and stood in front of the house, taking in the siding I repainted myself, the porch I once decorated with pumpkins in the fall, the windows I imagined my future kids drawing paper snowflakes for at Christmas. Dreams I'd tucked away. Dreams my parents had trampled on. I pushed the thought aside and unlocked the front door. Inside, the house felt hollow, stripped of the clutter they'd filled it with. The stagers had done their job well. Everything looked neutral, warm, inviting. For a moment, I remembered walking through the home for the first time long before it became a battlefield. I remembered the excitement of picturing where my furniture would go, how I'd furnish the guest room, how I imagined hosting holidays. That version of me felt so far away. I walked through each room slowly, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. In the pantry, I found a small tin I'd forgotten about my grandmother's old cookie cutters. I held them in my hand, feeling a sudden sting of nostalgia. The last thing I baked in this house had been a batch of sugar cookies before my parents told me they were taking over the kitchen for stress reasons. I put the tin in my bag. In the hall closet, I found something I didn't expect, an envelope with my name on it postmarked 3 months earlier. I opened it with the edge of my nail. Inside was a refund check from my insurance company, just over $700. They'd intercepted even this. My parents hadn't bothered to tell me it came. I stood there a moment, letting the small betrayal settle into the larger one. When I stepped onto the back porch, I saw Naomi's car pull up. She walked toward me with her usual brisk pace, clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Ready for the walkthrough?" "I am," I said, and for once the words felt true. We moved through the house together. She checked light fixtures, faucets, appliances, surfaces. I followed her quietly, watching the space become something I no longer belonged to, not because it wasn't mine, but because it had taken too much from me to stay. "Everything looks great," Naomi said, writing her final note. "The buyers should be here any minute." Right on cue, a car pulled into the driveway. Evan and Lila stepped out, holding hands, eyes bright with anticipation. They smiled the way people do when they're walking toward a future they've chosen for themselves. It struck me then I never got the chance to do that with this house. But maybe this was what closure looked like. "Hi, Mara," Lila greeted, waving. "We're so excited." Their excitement was genuine, open, warm, unmarred by entitlement. They weren't taking something from me. They were receiving something I no longer needed to carry. Inside, they moved gently through the rooms, pointing at details, imagining furniture, talking about where the crib would go when they eventually had kids. The smallest bedroom, they said. The one Aubrey had once declared too tiny for someone like her. "You've taken great care of this place," Evan said. I almost laughed. If only he knew how much care went into saving it from the people who lived in it. When they walked up the stairs, I stayed behind, standing in the sunlit hallway. I could hear their voices drifting through the rooms, hopeful, eager, filled with the kind of joy this house was meant to hold. Something inside me softened. For the first time, the house felt like it was going to be loved properly. Back at the attorney's office, the paperwork spread across the polished table like a roadmap. Naomi sat beside me, explaining each page, while Evan and Lila sat opposite, fingers intertwined. The attorney's pen clicked once. "Are we ready to sign?" he asked. I nodded. I signed my name again and again, each stroke of the pen cleaner steadier. By the final signature, I felt lighter, as if shedding the invisible weight I'd carried for a decade. "Congratulations," the attorney said. "The property now officially belongs to the Harris family." Evan and Lila beamed at me with gratitude. "We promise to take good care of it," Lila said softly. I smiled back. "I know you will." When I walked out of the building into the cold December air, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "Thinking of staying a few extra days, Aubrey wants another spa package. You can cover it, right? Merry Christmas." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned the phone over and watched the screen dim. They were still living in the fantasy they built on top of me, never knowing the ground had shifted beneath them. I got into my car, started the engine, and looked back at the attorney's office through the windshield. Everything was done. Final. Irreversible. My name was no longer tied to the place my family had twisted into their entitlement. I drove away feeling something I hadn't felt in years, freedom sharp and bright as winter sunlight. Let them enjoy their cruise, I thought, because when they came home, the life they scripted for themselves would be gone. Their cruise ship docked just after sunrise, the sky streaked pink and gold as travelers shuffled off with sunburned skin and tangled hair. My parents were among them, dragging matching suitcases and complaining loudly about the early hour. Aubrey filmed a short video for her social feed, pouting into the camera as she said, "Back to reality." Boo! My father laughed and clapped her on the back. Reality isn't so bad when you've got a home waiting for you. Home. They said the word like it belonged to them. They boarded their flight still glowing from the luxury they hadn't paid for. Diana texted me a photo of herself leaning against the railing of the ship captioned, "Best Christmas ever. You missed out." An hour later, heading home. Hope the house is warm, and finally from Aubrey Sis, "Can you refill your card? I want to buy duty-free perfume." I didn't answer. Not then. Not ever again. When their Uber pulled into the driveway of what they still believed was their house, the winter sun was low and sharp, reflecting off the windows. Aubrey shivered dramatically as she stepped out. Diana muttered about the cold. Carl grumbled as he reached for the house key he'd proudly insisted on keeping because I'm the man of the house. He jammed the key into the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again harder. The metal scraped loudly. Diana rolled her eyes. "Carl, honestly, you always break things. Let me do it." She tried. Nothing. Aubrey sighed. Maybe the lock froze. Ugh, this neighborhood. Carl knocked on the door, annoyed. "Open up," he shouted, as if the house would obey. Footsteps approached from inside. The handle turned. The door opened. And instead of me, or the version of me they imagined cowering on the other side there, stood Lila Harris wearing a cozy sweater, her hair in a loose bun, a mug of coffee warming her hands. She blinked at the three strangers on her porch. "Can I help you?" Carl puffed out his chest. "We live here." Lila frowned. "I'm sorry." "What?" "We live here." Diana repeated, her voice rising. "This is our home." Behind Lila, Evan stepped into view. "Is something wrong?" Carl barked. "Why are you in our house?" Lila and Evan exchanged an alarmed look before Evan answered calmly. "Sir, we closed on this home yesterday." Diana froze. Aubrey's mouth fell open. Carl shook his head violently. No, that's impossible. We've lived here for years." Lila opened the door a little wider and held up a folder, the closing packet Naomi had given them. Page after page showed their names, their signatures, their official ownership. Diana's skin went pale. Aubrey burst into tears, instantly wailing like she had as a child denied a toy. "This must be some mistake," Diana snapped. "We're calling the police." Ironically, someone else had already done that. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the shouting, and one of them had called in a disturbance. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. An officer stepped out, calm but firm. "What seems to be the issue here?" Carl jabbed a finger toward the house. "These people broke into our home." The officer asked for IDs, looked at documents, ran a quick database check. Then he straightened his voice final. "Sir, according to county records, the Harris family are the legal owners of this property. You are trespassing. You need to leave immediately." Diana fell apart, sobbing uncontrollably. Aubrey clung to her suitcase, tears streaming down her face. Carl sputtered, turning red. "There must be some mistake. Our daughter owns this house." The officer shook his head. "Not anymore." Aubrey grabbed her phone. "Call Mara." "Call her." Carl dialed my number. I didn't answer. Diana tried. I didn't answer. Aubrey tried. Straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, the Harris family apologized politely to the police for the confusion and gently closed the door. The lock clicked. My parents remained on the porch, their suitcases at their feet, their dignity collapsing in pieces. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch, staring at my phone. The screen was lit up like a Christmas tree, texts, missed calls, voicemails. 50 missed calls in less than 6 hours. I finally played the first voicemail. "Mara, call me back right now," my mother's voice snapped. "Something strange is happening. People are in the house. You didn't tell us anyone was renting it." The second was angrier. "Fix this. You hear me? Fix this." The third came from Aubrey, frantic and high-pitched. "Why are strangers in our house? What did you do?" I scrolled forward. By voicemail 10. My mother's voice had changed. It cracked with fear. "Mara, please. We don't understand. The police made us leave. Call us back. You can't do this to us." By voicemail 15, the anger was gone. Only panic remained. "We have nowhere to go. We're at a motel. Your father's card isn't working. Please, please call." I sat in silence, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Then I pressed it. One voicemail disappeared, then another, and another. One by one, I erased their cries, their demands, their manipulations, years of guilt compressed into digital fragments I no longer needed to carry. Outside my window, the world moved on. Cars passed. Kids laughed. Someone took their dog for an evening walk. Inside, I felt nothing but an indescribable lightness. They were finally facing consequences. Consequences I didn't need to mediate, soften, or rescue them from. I set my phone down, turned off the volume, and packed my last bag for my flight the next morning. For the first time in years, their chaos was not my responsibility. This time, I was choosing myself. I left Raleigh before dawn, the sky still dark enough that the city lights blurred into soft halos on the wet pavement. I didn't bother turning on the radio. The silence felt cleaner, lighter. My car was packed with just 2 suitcases and a box of essentials. The rest was either donated or already shipped to Boulder. I didn't look back as I merged onto the highway. I'd already left that version of myself behind. Raleigh faded into the distance as the airport signs appeared. I parked, hauled my luggage inside, and checked in without the familiar knot of dread that had lived in my stomach for years. At the gate, I sat by the window watching planes taxi and lift into the sky one after another, each one shedding the ground beneath it. I felt like I was doing the same. I turned my phone on for a moment, just long enough to see the flood of missed calls waiting like a storm I refused to walk into. Dozens from my mother, dozens from my father, more from Aubrey. As soon as the notifications finished pouring in, I powered the phone off again. I didn't need their voices echoing in my head as I boarded a flight toward a life they never wanted me to have. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. I grabbed my carry-on and joined the line. My hands shook a little, not from fear, but from something like release. When the plane lifted off, Raleigh shrinking below, I felt a weight loosen inside my chest. I watched the city blur into clouds. Somewhere over Tennessee, a voicemail preview appeared on my lock screen before the phone fully shut off. Only one line played before the device powered down again. My mother's voice cracking through the static. "How could you abandon your family like this?" The accusation slid past me like smoke. For once, it didn't sink in. When the plane landed in Colorado, the mountains greeted me like something out of a postcard. Massive, snow-capped, ancient, and unmoving. I had forgotten what beauty felt like when it wasn't tied to someone else's needs. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside, sharp and invigorating. I inhaled deeply. This was mine now. I picked up my rental car and drove toward the small Airbnb I'd booked near downtown Boulder. The city buzzed with a soft hum, students biking past, families walking dogs, the scent of coffee drifting from open cafe doors. I parked, hauled my luggage inside, and collapsed onto the bed with a long exhale. For the first time in years, the space around me didn't feel like something I needed permission to occupy. The next morning, after a restless but hopeful night, I walked into the financial consulting firm for my interview. The office was warm, filled with natural light, and decorated with art that looked like it belonged in an actual gallery, not a waiting room. People smiled when they passed me, not because they needed something from me, but because they were simply being kind. The interview itself felt surreal. The hiring manager actually listened when I spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and treated my resume like it meant something. When she said, "Your experience is impressive," my throat tightened. I wasn't used to praise that wasn't attached to obligation. "We'd like to offer you the position," she said an hour later. "If you're interested." "I am," I said, and meant it. Walking back to my Airbnb, I felt taller, lighter, whole. That afternoon, the front desk called my room. "Ms. Jensen, someone phoned asking for you," the clerk said. "We don't give out guest information, but we thought you should know." My stomach dropped for a moment, instinctively bracing for danger. Old conditioning. Then I breathed out slowly. "Thank you," I said. "I'm not expecting any calls." I hung up and let the silence settle. They were looking for me, searching, scrambling. But their panic wasn't my responsibility anymore. I didn't owe them my location, my safety, or my time. Later, a text came from a distant cousin. "Your parents are staying in a motel. They're fighting nonstop. Aubrey left earlier and hasn't come back. Thought you'd want to know, but I didn't. Not really." That guilt that had once eaten me alive now felt foreign, like a language I no longer spoke. I set the phone aside and went for a walk, letting the cold mountain air clear my mind. The streets were lined with bookstores, small shops, cafes glowing with warm lights. I stopped at one and ordered a latte, sipping it by the window. This life, this quiet, sweet, ordinary life felt like something I'd always been reaching for without realizing it. 2 days later, I started therapy. The first session was harder than I expected. I talked about the house, the years of sacrifice, the favoritism that shaped me, the emotional contortion required to be the good one. The therapist nodded gently and said one sentence that made my chest ache. "What you describe isn't a family dynamic. It's exploitation." Hearing someone else say it calmly and professionally made tears rise unexpectedly. Not grief recognition. "I sold the house," I told her, "and I left." She smiled softly. "You saved yourself." That night, I sat on the balcony of my Airbnb, wrapped in a blanket, watching the pink glow fade from the mountains. I turned my phone on again. One new message from Aubrey appeared. "Mara, please. We need to talk. No demands. No threats. Just fear." I didn't answer. Not yet. But I didn't block her either. As the sky darkened and the mountains disappeared into shadow, I whispered into the night. "Whatever comes next, I'm not going back." And for the first time, I felt certain I wouldn't. The knock came just after sunset, a soft, hesitant tapping that barely rose above the sound of the wind brushing against the balcony. I wasn't expecting anyone. I'd barely told anyone in Boulder that I existed. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I wasn't home, but something in the rhythm, slow, uncertain, almost trembling, pulled me toward the door. When I opened it, Aubrey stood there. Her blonde hair hung limp around her face, no makeup, dark circles smudged beneath her eyes. She had a suitcase beside her and a purse clutched to her chest like a lifeline. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, as if the weight of our parents' chaos had finally begun to crush her. "I hired a private investigator," she said before I could even speak. Her voice cracked thin and unsteady. "Please, Mara, just let me come inside." I stepped back wordlessly and watched her sink onto my couch as if she'd been holding herself upright through sheer force. She glanced around the apartment, modest, clean, quiet. So different from the house she'd once claimed would be hers someday. Her eyes lingered on the plants by the window, the folded blanket on the chair, the framed print on the wall. A home built by someone who finally learned to choose herself. "You have a nice place," she whispered, trying to smile. It faded instantly. You seem like you're doing well." "I am," I said simply. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I figured." Then she covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I watched for a moment, letting the emotions settle before sitting in the chair across from her. "What do you want, Aubrey?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "To apologize." Her voice wavered, but her eyes met mine with something I'd never seen in them before: honesty. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see. I don't blame you. But I needed to talk to you face to face. I didn't say anything. I wanted to hear all of it." She took a breath, gathering herself. "Living with Mom and Dad these past few weeks?" She shuddered. It's hell, Mara. They're impossible. They blame me for everything. They scream. They argue all night. They act like I owe them something. Like I ruined their lives. I raised an eyebrow. Sound familiar? Aubrey let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, it does. She twisted her fingers together. I didn't understand what they did to you. Not really. I thought you were just dramatic or overly independent. I thought they relied on you because you were stronger. I didn't realize they were draining you. You helped them drain me, I said quietly. She flinched, tears filling her eyes. I know, and I'm sorry, for all of it. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Sorry doesn't undo years, Aubrey. She nodded again, shoulders slumping. I know, but I needed you to understand something. She looked at me with a rawness that made my chest tighten. Mom and Dad treat me exactly the way they treated you. Nothing I do is good enough. Everything is my responsibility. They expect me to fix things I didn't break. They say I'm selfish if I don't give them everything. Her voice cracked. They're drowning me, Mara. There it was, the realization I'd waited my whole life for, arriving not with triumph but with a strange, aching sadness. I kept thinking, she continued, that if I just tried harder, they'd appreciate me. But they don't. They want control. That's all they've ever wanted. I exhaled slowly. That's what I spent 30 years trying to explain. Aubrey nodded, crying again. They told me the house would be mine someday. They made me believe it. They made me think you didn't even care about it, that you didn't want it. Her voice steadied. But when you sold it, I finally saw the truth. It was never theirs to give. It was yours. And they treated you like you didn't matter. I looked at her for a long moment. You didn't question it. I know. She swallowed. Because I benefited from it. Because I was selfish. Because I let myself believe their version of things. Her honesty was a soft blow to the chest, painful but real. She wiped her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't expect you to let me back into your life. I just needed you to know I finally understand. We sat in silence, the kind that feels like old wounds breathing. After a moment, I asked, So what do you want now? She laughed shakily. I don't know. I don't want to live with them anymore. I don't want to be their puppet. But I don't know how to walk away. You did it. How I looked at her carefully. I chose myself. You'll have to do the same. They won't change. They'll never suddenly become different parents. You have to stop giving them access to you. Aubrey nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. I think I knew that. I just didn't want it to be true. We stood at the same time, almost in sync. She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me. For the first time in decades, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like surrender. I really am sorry, she whispered into my shoulder. I know, I said quietly. But apology doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means honesty. She nodded, accepting it. A few minutes later, she picked up her suitcase and walked to the door. Goodbye, Mara. Goodbye, Aubrey. When the door closed behind her, I stood in the stillness of my apartment, the mountains glowing faintly beyond the window. For the first time, we weren't the golden child and the forgotten one. We were just two women trying to survive the same parents. 1 year later, I woke to soft light spilling across my bedroom floor, the pale Colorado sun rising behind the snowy peaks outside my window. My cat Juniper stretched beside me, nudging my arm with her head until I scratched behind her ears. The apartment was quiet, warm, and entirely mine. There were no footsteps in the hallway that didn't belong to me. No voices calling my name with demands attached. No lingering weight of guilt pressing against my ribs. Just the morning, the mountains, and a life I had finally begun to build on my own terms. I made coffee and stood by the balcony door as the steam curled into the chilly air. A year ago, Everything in my life felt like it was collapsing. Now everything felt possible. My job at the consulting firm had grown into something steady and fulfilling. I'd earned a promotion 3 months earlier, and for the first time in my career, my work felt seen, appreciated without strings, praised without expectation. My colleagues invited me on weekend hikes, potlucks, dinners. I had friends who didn't need me to rescue them, friends who simply enjoyed who I was. It was a strange, beautiful adjustment. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin. She sent updates every few weeks, not because I asked, but because she understood that sometimes closure comes in pieces. My parents had eventually moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment an hour outside Raleigh. My mother worked part-time at a grocery store, something she once told me she'd never be caught doing. My father's health had declined and he now used a cane. Their financial situation was tense and messy. The credit card company had finished their fraud investigation and held them responsible for the charges on my card. Aubrey had moved to Atlanta. She got a job at a salon and rented a small studio apartment. She didn't ask my parents for anything, and they complained constantly about her abandoning them. But she didn't cave. The last update said she was doing better, still struggling but growing in ways she never had before. I didn't feel anger hearing these updates anymore. Not satisfaction either. Just distance. A soft kind of acceptance. That morning, I found a letter in my mailbox, addressed in my mother's handwriting. I carried it upstairs, sat at my kitchen table, and opened it. The pages inside were filled with grievances, accusations, dramatic claims that I'd destroyed the family, that I cared more about money than blood, that she'd always acted out of love. There was no accountability, no acknowledgement of the years I spent carrying them. Just the same old script. I slid the letter into my shredder and watched it disappear in thin, curling strips. Some doors are not meant to be reopened. Later in the afternoon, I walked to the local farmers market. Vendors called out greetings, dogs tugged on leashes, and the air smelled like cinnamon and roasted pecans. I bought fresh flowers and a loaf of sourdough and walked home with a small smile tugging at my lips. The ease of it all still surprised me. Ease wasn't something I'd been allowed to experience while living under my parents' expectations. Ease had been forbidden. Now it was my everyday companion. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the sun sink behind the Rockies in hues of gold and deep lavender. A breeze carried the smell of pine and cold air. I closed my eyes and breathed in the life I'd chosen. I thought about the house. I thought about the click of the pen as I signed the papers, the moment I packed my last box, the voicemail I deleted, the flight to Colorado, the first night I slept without fear of a phone call demanding something from me. Selling the house wasn't revenge, not really. It was a severing of chains I had worn so long I forgot they were there. It was choosing my sanity over a legacy of obligation. It was the first moment I had ever stood fully in my own life and said, enough. Some people think letting go is cruelty, but sometimes letting go is the only way to survive people who refuse to see you as human. My phone buzzed again. A single text from Aubrey. I hope you're doing well. I'm trying my best too. I read it twice. A small warmth bloomed in my chest. Not reconciliation. Not repair, but truth. She was doing the one thing our parents never taught us to do, try. I typed a simple response. I hope you're okay too. No more. No less. I set my phone aside and looked at the mountains glowing with the last breath of daylight. And for the first time I felt something like peace, deep quiet, unmistakably mine. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is admitting how long you stayed where you were never meant to be. If you're listening to this and you've walked away from a toxic pattern, or if you're standing at the edge of that decision now, I hope my story reminds you that it's not selfish to save yourself. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you'll ever do. And if any part of my journey spoke to you, I'd love to hear your story too. Share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps more than you know. If you want more stories like this, stories about courage, healing, and reclaiming your life, Feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the next chapter. We're building something strong here, and you deserve to be part of it.